You are just about to watch me make this sword. I've made about 24 different swords over the last few years, and I gotta say, I'm getting better. This is the best one so far. If you have ever thought you might be interested in learning to make something like this, and you can learn it, I've put together a list of the basic tools and equipment that you need, that you've got to have to start blacksmithing. You can download that at startblacksmithing.com. Let's get started blacksmithing. The Damascus steel billet that I'm starting with here is about 24 inches long, about 1 5/8 inches wide, and 5/16 of an inch thick. The first thing I'm doing is heating up and upsetting a small portion of this billet about 4 inches from the end that will be the handle. This is to provide enough material in the cross section in this area for the ricasso, which is where the sword blade will transition and connect with the hilt, or quillins, and then the handle. This is a tedious process, and the upset must be kept even and centered on the bar. Next, I started drawing out the tang for the handle. Now, like I said, this is a Damascus or pattern welded steel, and I spotted a delamination or a separation between the layers starting. So as I begin to reduce the cross section of the handle end, I'm going to start just gently, by hand, at the anvil, and then I'm adding a little flux to try to re-weld the flaw in the next heat. Once I get it tightened up and I have confidence in the weld inside the bar, I go ahead and draw it out at the Chambersburg until it's a uniform 1/4 inch thickness with a nice even taper in width. With the tang fully forged, it's time to work on the blade. I start out at the end, at the very tip, trying to create the point, and always remembering that since it's Damascus, I've got to work at a high heat when I'm moving the steel this far. From the point of the sword, I move back slowly and methodically towards the handle, about 3 or 4 inches at a time, hammering the blade from both sides, really from all 4 sides, and shaping the blade as I go. You can expect a double-edged broadsword to gain about 20% in length as it's forged from the billet to its final size and geometry. Now this one will not quite be that much because I'm leaving so much of the ladder of the end third full width. And then I'm leaving lots of thickness everywhere to make sure that the inclusions grind out later. It's a little hard to tell, but as I'm working on the geometry of this blade, I'm working on all four of the faces. I want the center of the blade to be the thickest and fairly straight down that center line as I forge it, and then I'm tapering the thickness out to the edges, leaving plenty of room to grind away anything that has a flaw in it. The shape of this sword is going to be different from any other that I've made because it's for a young woman. I'm kind of visualizing Bilbo Baggins in my mind here and hammering out what reminds me of an elvish sword or something like it. Now it may be slightly less practical than other sword shapes, but it's more elegant. And let's face it, there's really nothing practical at all about a sword these days. After it's forged to shape, I give it an initial grind. What I'm doing is continuing to bring the shape out of this piece by removing the material on the edges to keep the shape symmetric, really symmetric if I can, and smoothing out any high and low spots up and down all four sides of this blade. I'm thinking much less about the edges when I'm doing this and more about the center line of the sword. There are two planes coming into contact on each side of the sword at the center, and I want that center line to be straight on both sides. Getting this right might be the most challenging part of building a sword. The next item of significance that I'm doing in the forging process is to stamp my touch mark into the sword right at the ricasso. Once this thing is heat treated, I will not want to risk bringing it up to temperature again to put in a touch mark. So you've got to make sure you take care of anything like that or clean up any forging mistakes before you go to the heat treating process. Heat treating a piece of carbon steel is where a blacksmith works at the molecular level. The first step is to normalize the blade. So I think it's flat. I think the taper is good. I think that it's going to be grindable and I don't see any big inclusions or delaminations, so we're hopeful. Now we normalize. Normalizing a forged blade means bringing it up to critical temperature. Don't let it stay there very long, and then letting it cool very slowly. I like to do this at least twice on a blade like this. So this is normalized. It was in here for 12 hours, which means after the first 2 hours, it had been cooled very slowly down to, I don't know, a couple hundred degrees. So look at that thing. Heavily scaled, but even through the scale, you can see the difference in the color of the midsection in this thing. That's very interesting to me. Fairly straight. Gonna take a little work. The next step, and the most exciting step in the heat treating process, involves bringing the entire piece up to critical temperature and then quenching it. I do a vertical quench on a sword like this, and the quench usually happens in oil. This oil brings the temperature down quickly enough to harden it, but not so quickly that it will break. Now before I quench the sword in this quench tank, I warm the oil up to decrease the viscosity. This allows the oil to circulate around the sword while it is cooling, so the cooling happens a little quicker. Now listen up. Be very careful when you're doing this. Do not hold the sword with your hand. The flames will go straight up, the oil is boiling and spitting and jumping, and you will catch yourself on fire. I've seen it happen right here in my very own shop. So use tongs, gloves, and eye protection. Our oven is just barely big enough to put this sword in there in its entirety, corner to corner. It'll fit in just barely. And the oven goes up to 550 degrees, which is straining an electric oven, but gets to a pretty good spring temperature. Just a little low, but you know, pretty good. So I'm going to wrap this in tin foil. That shields the blade from the direct radiant energy from the burners, so that it warms up from the ambient temperature inside the oven instead of from the radiant energy out of the burner. I'm going to wrap this thing in tin foil. I'm going to put it in the oven, set it for 540 degrees, and let it, once it comes up to temperature, I'm going to let it soak in there for about an hour. Should be a nice temper. Tempering is the final step in heat treating, and it means slowly heating the steel up to the temperature that will draw it back or soften it to the compromise between hardness and springiness that the tool needs. In the case of a sword, that is a spring temper, around 550 degrees or so, and a full royal blue color. How nice the spring temper blue is on that. I would never be able to get it that nice with a torch. So what that means is that there are orcs nearby. Thanks for watching this video. Part 2 is going to cover forging and fitting the Damascus pommel and quillins, making the ironwood handle, final polish, etching, and assembly. Blacksmithing is really a terrific hobby, and I just cannot recommend it highly enough. If it's something you might be interested in, if you ever thought you might be interested in it, like I've mentioned earlier, I've put together a list of the basic tools you're going to need, where to find them, how much you might have to pay, and you can download this list at startblacksmithing.com.